And that was really the very beginning of me to start kind of trying to at least rationally think about what had transpired, how it affected me, how I was handling it, how had I handled it, how could I handle it go forward. It was a challenging time period for sure.
From the emotional side for you, in looking back on it now, and maybe you realized it at the time, was there stuff that you weren't journaling because you just didn't want to think about it or address it?
No, I actually was still like making sure I caught all of it. And I remember at the time thinking, observing that I was making note of everything, even though I wasn't always capable of feeling it. So there were a lot of times when these things would be happening and it would almost seem just very businesslike to me. It was like looking at a series of facts without any of the emotion tied to it, seeing it pretty clearly, or at least thinking I saw it pretty clearly, but becoming more and more aware of like, you should be feeling something about this. And really I was feeling nothing. It was an observation. I felt empathy for other people, but I didn't feel that like sadness for myself, or I wasn't upset like I probably should have been, or anyone should have been or could have been at the time about any of those things.
There was an instance where you lost a friend and fellow pilot, and you talk about how you broke down crying, and it really kind of hit you like a ton of bricks. But then going forward from that, it was like there wasn't even tears anymore.
Nothing.
Did it ever get to a point for you where it almost kind of scared you that you were losing that emotional connection?
It didn't scare me, but I was very aware of it.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. I've got a repeat guest this time, and he's back with his newly published first book. It's called Hangar 4. Cover looks just like this one, for those of you who are watching the video. Mine actually says not for resale on it because that's a cool version when you actually know the author. But the book is Hangar 4. You can also go back to episode 97 to get more of our conversation into his life growing up, his decisions to join the Marine Corps, that aspect of it. We don't go that deep in this episode. A little bit more about him, though. He spent 20 years in the Marine Corps. He was a helicopter pilot, flew CH-53s, which are nicknamed the Heavies. Basically, these are the big helicopters that are used to move large numbers of troops or heavy loads of equipment. He was somebody who definitely pushed the envelope during his career. But this also helped him, for instance, being tapped to assist the 160th Special Operations Aviation Unit, as well as other opportunities and some of the things in his book that he talks about that maybe rubbed some senior officers the wrong way. He ultimately spent, like I said, 20 years in the Marine Corps. He had 4 combat deployments, and the book has those stories. And we get into some of them, leaving some for you to read when you actually get your copy of the book. By the way, there's a link in the description for you to be able to buy your own copy, and I highly recommend it. But equal to the combat stories, his book also shares the personal side of things. His personal struggles with remaining constantly vigilant. He basically spent the entire 20 years either deployed or in a training cycle. And that forced him to constantly feel like he was always needing to be ready to go. Well, that had a negative impact. Had a negative impact on his family, which ultimately had a negative impact on him. And he's very candid about it in the book. The book is actually based on the journals that he kept through his entire career. So it's got some of the fun stories and the fun things he did, but it also shows behind the curtains the struggles that he went through and his family went through during those 20 years. The book's a great read, like I said, so go get yourself a copy of it. But let's get into episode 139, Here's Isaac Lee, call sign Whiskey. It's crazy that it's been almost a year since you were last here.
It doesn't seem that long.
Time flies, man.
It goes fast.
But,
Really
you know,
fast.
now you're a published author.
Barely, yeah. I'm a few hours into that.
Are you going to become we were already talking about it, but you're going to become a social media, influencer?
I doubt it. We'll see how it goes.
How's been the process already to this point, just in kind of getting the book out there and marketing it?
It's been an education. I actually have a degree in advertising and marketing that I never used until now. So it's come in a little bit handy. But I had to learn, social media, where people, who's on what platform, what's the best way to communicate with them. And really came up with, a deliberate plan. And started doing that about 3 months ago. So about 3 months before release, set up author-specific pages on Facebook, Instagram, and then, still smartly every now and then using LinkedIn, X, as we call it now, and a couple of the other platforms, but just to really get the word out. And the most important thing for me was just having kind of a steady drumbeat of different things that I was putting out consistently to let people know that this was coming and what it was about, and hopefully get them interested.
For you, was there any apprehension about putting you out into the world a little bit more?
I'll be honest. Initially, no. So I'm writing this thing. It's very personal. It's going out, and I'm not thinking twice about it. I had become very convinced that I felt very good about my why. Why am I doing this? Why does it matter? How is it potentially maybe even a tiny bit important? So I felt good, but I will tell you, it kind of hit me just a few days ago when it was like getting close to publication. And I'm not someone that ever feels anxious about like anything ever. I mean, it says so in the book, right? I talk about there's plenty of times in my life I probably should have been anxious and wasn't. But about 3 or 4 nights ago, I woke up and I was super anxious, and I had this dream, and I never remember my dreams, but that someone left a box of these books on my front porch, like with a bunch of red pen corrections in them. And I was like, oh, wow. Yeah. Thousands of people potentially are going to read this thing. So I hope I didn't screw anything up. And it wasn't so much the content as just that last second paranoia about like, did we catch everything in the editing process? Is this thing tight? Did I say anything in here that's factually incorrect? Did I miss a date? I think it's just that at the last minute, feeling a little bit of that. But as far as the content, no, I feel good about it.
There's a lot of different directions I want to go. And for those who didn't listen to the first episode, and I'm killing myself because I'm drawing a blank, but I believe it's episode 97.
Sounds right.
We obviously went deeper into your backstory and your career, and we don't need to go all the way through it. But for those who didn't listen to that episode, give a real brief overview of just kind of your time in the Marine Corps and exactly what you did.
Yeah, sounds good. I was originally from Lubbock, Texas, grew up there. Thought I was going to be a Major League Baseball player. That didn't work out, so I enrolled in classes at Texas Tech. Really just because I thought I was supposed to go to college, not because I had any burning desire to or a passion for what I was studying. Did that very late in the process, somewhat randomly, decided to pursue a career in the military, specifically in aviation. Found my way into the Marine Corps from there. My timing was either amazing or terrible, depending on your perspective. I went to officer candidate school in the summer of 97. And by the time I went through the entire officer candidate school, the basic school, flight school, I got to my first fleet squadron at Miramar in December of 2000. Obviously, just a few months prior to 9/11. No idea that was coming, of course. Went on my first deployment that summer. I was on my first deployment when 9/11 happened. And then from there, it was just everything changed. The whole trajectory of my career as a Marine changed. We were, in combat essentially from that point until the time I retired in 2017. So I ended up doing 3 tours in Iraq as a captain on that first fleet tour. And then I got selected to go out to the Weapons and Tactics School to be an instructor. And that was really just a byproduct of, again, timing. I'd just done all of this combat stuff. So I was in a good position to go teach other people how to do it. So I went out there for 3 years, put me through a 1-year master's program. And then I went right back to the fleet as a major and did a deployment to Afghanistan where I was a detachment officer in charge. Came home from that, shortly thereafter, I got asked to go do another deployment on a Marine Expeditionary Unit as the detachment officer in charge, which is kind of a unique opportunity to get to do that twice as a major. Typically, if you're lucky, you do it once. I got to do it twice. And then I went to the Pentagon for a year, worked as a budget officer, and that job was really kind of to put me on track for things to come. But I had only been there a few months. I got slated for command of a squadron back at Miramar. So I came right back to the fleet the next summer, took command of a squadron, did another deployment. That was just in Okinawa, back kind of more of call it a peacetime deployment. And then when that was complete, decided I was going to transition out. So I spent my last year at 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing at Miramar working in the operations staff for the commanding general down there, and then transitioned out in 2017. So it was kind of a whirlwind there for 20 years.
And you talk about it in the previous episode that what eventually became the book was your journal that you kept your entire time when you were in the Marine Corps.
It was. So I fortunately started a journal when I first went to officer candidate school. And initially it was just, I was so like enamored with everything that was happening. And the drill instructors were like, it was like watching Full Metal Jacket, but they were real, right? And so my initial thought
Wait a minute, Full Metal Jacket wasn't real?
But these guys were so entertaining. Like I got in trouble at officer candidate school all the time for laughing. I thought they were the funniest people in the world. And then I would get yelled at for laughing. But I was just so enamored with everything that was happening. It was like this huge adventure. So I was like, I need to write this down or I'm never going to remember it. And so it really just started out as jotting down some notes in these little green notebooks they give you. And for whatever reason, thankfully, I just never stopped. So I kept that journal going all the way through flight school into the fleet. And by the time I got to the fleet, at that point, computers were a little more prevalent. And I'm such a dork. I'd taken the time to go back and type everything that I'd handwritten to that point. So at that point, it's electronic. And I just kept up with it from there. And it became like a very good exercise for me, kind of a decompression exercise. Like I liked writing. I wasn't sure if I was particularly good at it, but to me, it was just, I'm going to capture this experience because if I don't, I'm never going to remember all of these things and these people and these, events that took place. And some of that was the flights and details about those. And some of it was just dumb stuff that went on when the Marines we were messing around, but it was this thing I had. So by the time I retired, I had several hundred pages of this thing and I'd captured the entirety of the experience. So I kind of had this loose idea for a while, like, I should do something with this. But it took me quite a while to get to a point where I was like, okay, let's actually sit down and turn this into a book.
In the book, what I really took from it, and I think it's more driven by what I want to do with this podcast, but you get very personal as far as not only your struggles with maintaining a home life through all of the deployments, but your experiences, as you already kind of alluded to, maybe making some comments that weren't the most appropriate and not when I say appropriate, but to a ranking officer saying something that was the first thing that kind of came to your mind. And so I really enjoyed kind of the journey, but I could really see the struggles that you were dealing with through the deployments coming towards your transition. After you transitioned out, did you ever just go back to that journal and just kind of relive it to kind of bring yourself back to it? Or was it, hey, I'm putting this in a box and I'm kind of forgetting about it?
Well, a little of both. So when I initially transitioned out of the Marine Corps, I was so focused on starting my next career and really kind of working on myself in a personal way that those two things were at the top of the list, right there next to, trying to get my family and myself all together at the same time, moving forward in a positive direction, because it had impacted all of us in various ways. So that was really the priority. And so I transitioned out in 2017, and it was really probably late 2020 when I kind of started thinking about it again. Like life had sort of settled down enough where I had some bandwidth, and I started thinking I should go back and revisit this. And that thought initially was just for part of my own process and trying to get to my own closure, if you will. And I don't think I'll ever quite get there, but I was thinking about doing that in a more deliberate way. And then in 2021, I started hearing more and more stories, or hearing about other Marines that I had known that had transitioned out, or were in the process of transitioning, that were struggling in various ways. And that was everything from couldn't find a job, couldn't hold down a job, substance abuse problems, issues at home. And I was hearing those things. I was kind of simultaneously living some of them myself. And I understood and knew like what was wrong, for lack of a better way to put it. But I didn't know exactly what to do about it. So I was trying to sort of reach out to people as a friend, doing what you can for the people that you know. But all of that was sort of happening simultaneously. And at the same time, I was kind of in my own place with my personal seeking to understand myself and reconcile the experience for myself, that I ultimately just decided one day, you know what, I need to pull this journal out and go back through it in a meaningful way and turn it into a book. And if I do that, I kind of have my big idea was, if I do that, maybe that will be helpful to some people in some way, just sharing this story. But I knew for that to potentially be effective, I was going to have to be brutally honest in how I relayed that story. So no revisionist history whatsoever, even in instances where I know I myself probably look and sound like a jerk, because I was, but that was honest. And so I felt like that was the only way to do it. But having the journal allowed me to do that, because I was looking at my own words at the time that I wrote them. So I knew exactly what I was thinking, feeling, what my perspective was, what I was saying. And there were certainly moments where I'm recounting something that happened and thinking like, oh, you kind of screwed that up, or you probably should have gone about that differently. But I still felt like it was important to show anybody who read this the totality of that experience, how it affected me, how I handled it, sometimes well, sometimes not well, because I felt like people would find a lot of like commonality with their own experience if I were to do it that way. If I'd sanitized it and added revisionist history and made it all sound like it was great, then it would have been, to me, pointless to do it at all.
From the book's perspective, one of the things that I took from it is you clearly lay out you and how you dealt with the changes that came to you from deploying, being in combat. Something as subtle as having friends drive you to the base for when you're going to ship out, as opposed to having your wife. And where I'm going with this is you're very candid about, like you said, maybe some of the flaws, some of the things you did wrong, whatever. But I think this book would equally be interesting for the spouse's perspective on what their spouse is dealing with in a constant deployment situation.
I hope so. And that was one of the other reasons that I wrote it that way. And I'm hopeful that that's the case. I do think it'll be relatable for a lot of the Marine service members, even first responders, people who have lived a similar extreme lifestyle. But I also hope that it's helpful to the spouses, if for no other reason than to give them some insight if they are married to someone who's experienced similar things and doesn't know how to articulate that or what they're thinking or what they're feeling. It's like a look inside of what that psychology can ultimately become. And I actually got some very good feedback early in the process. Asked a few people, to read it and give me some feedback. And one of my peers, that was actually his feedback to me, was he said, "Hey, thank you for writing this. I don't know how to tell my wife what's going on inside my head, but now I don't have to. I can just hand this to her, thanks, and say, there's the answer. That's what's happening in my head." And so I'm hopeful that for families in general, that it's helpful that way too.
We've already failed Marketing 101 because I want to say we're probably 5 or 6 minutes into this now, and we haven't mentioned the name of your book yet. So
It's all good.
For those who haven't read it yet, how'd you come up with the name?
So the title is Hangar 4, and I just happened to spend literally all of my time in the fleet, stationed at Miramar in the CH-53 Echo squadrons there. And on Miramar, Hangar 4 is the CH-53 Echo hangar. So it's this central point in the story that the story keeps coming back to. You know, that was the hangar I walked into the very first time as a nervous young lieutenant, and the hangar that I conducted my retirement ceremony in several years later. So, and I always thought of it as home. You know, making it back to Hangar 4 meant you survived another deployment, you made it back home. And in a lot of ways, I'd think of, you know, it's just this cruddy old aircraft hangar sitting on a flight line out there. But I will always think of that building, I think, as home because of the significance that it played over the course of my career.
Did writing it put you in a position of any regret in getting out at 20?
No, it actually didn't. And in a lot of ways, I think it was more confirmation that I had done the right thing for me at the right time, because I knew that I won't say I knew it, but when I was approaching transition, I was approaching year 20. I came to believe the best thing for me and my family would be to transition out. And at that point, it was really even difficult for me to say why. There were some obvious family reasons. You know, my children at the time, they were teenagers. I didn't want my daughter to go to multiple high schools. There were some very practical parts of that. But the personal part of that was I felt like I was on a pace that probably wasn't sustainable. And I had come to understand myself just enough to know that I had the potential to be someone who, to say go off the rails probably isn't the right way to say it, but kind of. Like, I knew I had that potential. I knew my pack was heavy. I knew I'd been carrying this experience. I was super compartmentalized. I didn't really feel emotion well anymore. Positive emotion for the most part was okay, but all negative emotion had been totally shut down. You know, no grief, no fear, no anxiety, no any of that. And I knew that I kind of needed to figure that out. And I was worried that if I didn't, it was going to catch up to me. And so for me, I was glad that I transitioned when I did. And going back through this and writing this, to me, was just further confirmation that, like, yeah, you probably did the right thing. And who knows what would have happened had I not. I mean, maybe it would have been fine. Maybe it wouldn't have. You know, there's no telling. But it was a preemptive measure that I took, and I'm glad that I did.
You talk about how depending on what perspective you want to look at it in, you could almost say your progression or your regression when it comes to emotions. Mm-hmm. Through the book, with the more deployments you went on, you regressed in what you showed emotionally, almost to the point of becoming robotic,
yes,
as you describe it in the book.
Absolutely.
Was that from a operational standpoint, was that calculated on your part, or did it just happen over time?
It just kind of happened. But I would say in the initial stages of that, I was just doing it. Like, I was a young captain. We're in combat. I was just doing the job. And I was realizing a few things as that was happening. I was pretty good at it. Like, it was going well. I noticed that I really wasn't fearful at times when I probably should have been. And then I also started to notice, and this was the part that probably started to bug me the most, was that I liked it. Like, I really liked it. And at one point in the book, I even describe it as an addiction, because that's kind of what it came to feel like. Was combat flying became to feel like an addiction for me. And it was very much like any other drug that's not necessarily good for you. Like, it feels good when you're doing it, you like it, but at the same time you're aware, like, this probably isn't good for me. Like, there's another side to this coin. And so over the course of my career, I became more aware of that, and also more introspective and curious about it simultaneously, which was really an interesting kind of personal journey to go through. But in the initial stages, I was just doing it. And then I think it was my third deployment in Iraq where I first started to realize, like, this is affecting me a little different than most everyone else around me. And I can tell. And people are starting to make comments about it. And then that's when the awareness kind of started creeping up, like, yeah, you're a little odd.
And there's multiple stories in there of instances, where you get back from a mission and either your co-pilot or somebody else basically looked at you and go, "You're nuts."
Yeah, it happened a few times for sure.
Where I want to go real quick, because this was a question that I had and I've never heard about this before. So flying under NVGs in a complete brownout, and in the book, there's multiple instances of this, but you talk about it, I believe you referred to it as the leans, where you basically lose your perception. Even though you've got all your instruments and gauges in front of you, you get a sense of vertigo.
It is vertigo.
But what struck me as the most odd is your crew will also get the same feeling stuck in the back of the helicopter.
They can.
First off, what causes that? And then how do you fight through that?
So the basic cause of it is a lack of a visible horizon. And so you're in this aircraft and it's moving, but when it's that dark, and in Iraq and Afghanistan, it gets that dark where we call it low light level. There's a certain amount of lux that the moon produces, 0.0022. As soon as you go below that, your low light level, there basically is no light to amplify. And when you don't have a visible horizon, but you're in something that's moving like an aircraft, it can start to mess with your equilibrium. So you can start to feel like you're leaning over sideways when you're not, or you could be leaning over sideways in reality and feel like everything's fine. So as an aviator, it's on you to catch that quickly. And then they teach us very early in flight school, when that happens, you just look at your gauges and do what your gauges are telling you. Trust the aircraft is telling you the right answer. So even if you feel like you were laying on your side, but the aircraft's telling you straight and level, it's straight and level. And keep flying it like that's the case. It was less common for that to happen to our crew chiefs in the back, just because they have a little bit better visibility in the windows. But on occasion, it would happen to them too. And you knew when it started happening to them too that it was bad. It was a really dark night when that was happening.
And there was one instance where, though, a friend of yours actually crashed because of, and I guess where I'm going with that is, if you're completely relying on the instruments, what ends up happening that would cause the crash?
Well, it was a dicey situation for us all the time. And there were a lot of things that could get you. You think of combat, and the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is the enemy, but the weather, the light level, obstacles, all these other things, the aircraft itself, they all get a vote too. And in those early stages of OIF specifically, we were flying low altitude tactics. So you're at 200, 300 feet off the ground. And at the air speeds we're flying at, that's really only a couple of seconds away from impact should you make a mistake. So the margin for error is just razor thin. So if a crew started to feel the leans and just didn't catch it quick enough, they might not recover quick enough. It's very possible to get in that situation and be impacting the ground before you even realize that you're in that situation when you're flying that low. And that was part of the reason it was so dangerous. And we were aware of that all the time. There's a term for it, controlled flight into terrain, CFIT. But it happened, and it was a real thing.
And this may sound like a stupid question. There's never a point where you're just like, screw it, we can't fly anymore, because I understand that it's the catch-22 of it. You can't just arbitrarily land in potentially an enemy occupied area,
right?
But at the same token, you're completely without visibility.
Yeah, but we were very accustomed to that as well. So we flew a lot at night, and there's a moon up roughly half of the time, half of the month, and there's only one night per month where there's a moon up all the way from what we call WENT to BMNT. So end of evening nautical twilight to beginning of morning nautical twilight, meaning the entire night there's some kind of moon. Most nights it's a portion. You have moon for some of it and you don't for the other. But you can't adjust operations based on the moon. So we knew what the moon was doing. We studied it. We knew exactly what time we'd have illumination, which times we would not. But it was just an accepted part of the deal. We had to keep functioning and we had to fly, and honestly, flying at night in some ways was safer as far as the threat. So it was a constant game of trading one threat for the other. You know, at low altitude, you're safer against a man-portable air defense shot, shoulder-fired, you know, basically heat-seeking missile. But you're also closer to the ground, but it's dark. So you get some help with the enemy, because the darkness, you're taking all these things, all these factors, and just deciding what is the most safe situation in a generally very unsafe environment in which to function.
And going back to kind of that, if you want to call it that callous way of you operating in that environment. You talk about in one of the instances where you were taking some ground fire and it was kind of like, they're shooting behind us because they can't see us. Yep. So they're shooting where they're hearing.
Yeah, they're shooting at the sound. And so that was actually fairly common back then. And it was good. I mean, we knew that. So it was pretty common at night to see those rounds going behind you because they're shooting at the sound. And we understood that. And honestly, it made us want to fly at night even more. It was like, hey, great. Because if this was daytime, they probably would have let us appropriately and that would have sucked.
So going back to writing in your journal, obviously there's stuff that you have to do operations-wise when you land, but was it immediately after all that was done that you would go start writing, or would you kind of let it sit and kind of ruminate for a little bit?
Basically, my kind of routine became, especially on deployment, was that would be the last thing I did before I went to sleep. So regardless of what schedule I was on, because we had ops going 24 hours a day, and we had this whole system for moving back and forth crews from day crew, what we call day crew to night crew, or sometimes we called it morning crew. But whenever my day ended and I would get something to eat and like my little quiet time at the end of the day, there wasn't anything else to do anyway, other than, you know, you could read. That was about it. We didn't have Wi-Fi or anything back, you know, in the early stages of OIF. So it was just kind of a nightly activity. I would kind of jot down what happened. And sometimes that was very abbreviated. And sometimes it was like, oh, wow, I had this crazy flight. And I'd write a couple of pages to kind of capture it. But it was really just a decompression exercise that was good for me, and I jotted down and then honestly forget about it. But it was neat when I started writing the book. That was really the first time I'd gone back through and really read it. And one of the hardest things initially was I would find myself sitting down to write, and a couple hours would go by and I wouldn't have written anything. I was just still reading and going like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. I forgot about that. Totally forgot that guy, period. You know, there were so many things that were nice to remember. So I was glad I had it.
It's definitely something that from a parent's perspective, being able to put your experiences down that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, your grandkids can at least look back and get a little bit better picture of you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I thought about that, and that's definitely true. But I also felt, and this was, I call it somewhat of a secondary consideration, because my primary was really, I hope this is helpful to people, even just sharing this story. You know, if nothing else, if other people find this and they find some commonality and it feels like kind of their story too, that might be helpful to them. But I also felt like it was, or I knew this going in, there's very little written about flying assault support in the Marine Corps in a real way. And just the way that OIF and OEF unfolded, obviously our special operations teams and forces got very popular in the mainstream media, and deservedly so. They're incredible. But you got quite a few books written by Navy SEALs, you know, of course, and those stories are amazing. But the only helicopter guys that have really written books were in the Army and part of the Task Force 160 at the Night Stalkers. And that is the only special operations aviation unit in the United States military, and they're organic to SOCOM. So it's very similar to the SEALs and Delta Force and the Rangers and all these other rock stars. That's who they work with, and so they are very much rock stars too. They're the best in the world at what they do. So there's a couple of books written by those guys that are awesome. But on the actual Marine Corps side, there hasn't been anything written by an assault support pilot in a really long time. So the last book written by an assault support pilot, I believe, was Bonnie Sue, which is a Vietnam era book. Nothing in the modern era. There's a couple of, call them short stories and other books, but not a full book about flying assault support in combat. And there's never been a full book about flying 53s in combat ever. So I also felt like just sort of a sense of obligation to help capture our history, if you will, and written down somewhere. And I definitely think that other 53 pilots, and really not even just the pilots, the aircrew, maintainers, anyone who was in those squadrons during that era will find this to sound very familiar to them because they lived it too.
Well, and what I would say too, that you, going into this, obviously I knew a little bit about helicopters and their function, and for the most part, you probably get clumped in to, oh, those are the station wagons.
Yep.
Those are the slow moving station wagons. They just carry everything.
Yeah.
And for the most part, that is what you're doing.
It is.
And, Cobras and anything fast gets more of the attention.
Yeah.
What I found intriguing, though, was, and there's a couple missions in there, but where you don't think about this, not being a helicopter pilot, you were tasked with, hey, we got to go pick up something heavy and move it. And all of the mathematics and planning that even go on before you even take off.
Yeah.
And you almost seem to thrive in that problem solving.
I did. I really enjoyed that part of it. And that's definitely true. We talked about a little bit last year when I was here. The primary mission of 53s move people, move things. And so it's very logistical in nature, the mission, which is why being an assault support pilot is never going to be sexy or cool, and you're not going to get famous. Jet pilots get famous and they make movies about them, not assault support guys, and deservedly so. Cobra pilots get a lot of love and should. Their mission's amazing, and they were amazing, and a couple of those guys have written books. But you're right. For us, it has this logistical appearance. It's kind of this thing that's happening in the background, but it can be very complex and very dangerous. And there is a ton of planning that goes into it specifically for some of the execution of the big tactical things that kind of need to happen in the battle space for the big picture to keep moving. And to me, it was important to capture some of that and show some of that complexity and some of the things that we were able to do and really big moments and big situations that were critical for the force as a whole.
You have one story where you were, I want to say, some sort of container. And initially it was rigged as a single hook point.
Yeah.
And then you guys like, hey, we can't fly this. So it's got to go to a double hook point.
Yeah.
For somebody who's never flown a helicopter, but we've all driven a car in wind and you're fighting it, what's it like flying with something that heavy hanging below you?
Something that big on an external, you always felt it. I always would describe it as it was like having this giant barn door hanging off the bottom of the aircraft, and you're flying and the aircraft literally starts kind of it is moving you as you're moving it. And so for anything that large, typically we default to what we call the 2-point load. So there's 2 attachment points, and that keeps it more stable. For some reason that night, they had one of those rigged single point, and we decided, we'll give it a shot. It took us about 30 seconds to decide that was a bad idea. Took it back, set it back down, and let them re-rig it. But you definitely feel that. And especially if something's heavy, then you feel both, because you can see and feel your engine straining, the aircraft straining with just the weight. And at the same time, you've got this giant sail hanging off the bottom of it that's kind of pushing you around and rocking the aircraft. It's an interesting feeling.
To give you a little bit of credit, and I know you were trying to underplay it in the sense of who gets to be the rock star, so to speak. and the book has some amazing missions, and you've already talked about the 160th, and I would like to eventually get to that story where they basically said, hey, we need your help.
Yeah.
But going back on it a little bit, when we all think of any movie we've seen or any book we've read, the main character tends to have that F it. Let's try. And there's a lot of that in you.
For sure.
And one of the reasons why I believe you were successful in what you were able to accomplish is because you would buck the trend, so to speak, of, well, yeah, it might be a heavy load. Or there's a story about, you talk about one time you flew a helicopter with only 2 engines. You're like, I could do this. And then the next time you're like, I can get it off the ship with 2. And it was just the differences of one time someone said, hey, great job. One time someone, what? You're freaking crazy.
Yeah.
But As far as you and developing that sense of screw it, let's push the envelope, is that natural to you?
I think it was. Part of that's just my personality. And really it's a part, I would say, that started developing when I was a kid. And I would say my dad credit. It's a byproduct of what I learned on the dusty ball fields of West Texas. You know, he always pushed me to compete hard, to be a great teammate, but really a competitor. And he was always big on what he called physical toughness and mental toughness, with mental toughness being the most important. And I didn't realize this until years later, but I think that's really where it started for me. So I always kind of had a willingness, even as a kid, to take on things that seemed somewhat insurmountable and just kind of go at them like I wasn't the least bit fazed by it. You know, and so when you're a kid, that's, you know, playing a Little League game against some other kid who, for whatever reason, is already 6 feet tall and weighs 150 pounds and you're still a scrawny little guy. But you kind of develop some confidence there. But I was always kind of a natural limit pusher. And I never totally understood that about myself until really it was later in my career when I was really becoming more introspective and thinking about, like, why was I able to do this? Why do I function this way? And the truth is, I was always kind of a little bit of a handful as a junior officer in that that's an understatement. I was capable, I was confident, and definitely a handful. Like I know that, you know, officers that were senior to me at times were like, this guy, like, because I would speak up, I would ask questions, I would push back a little bit, but I would also go as hard as I could go, to the point that, I mean, I'm sure some could argue like, hey, you took this too far, you pushed this further than you should have. But in my mind, I was always just kind of looking at, like, where's the line? I'm going to operate like right on top of that, like all the time. And I was comfortable there, and I knew, I didn't know right away, but I figured out fairly quickly my comfort zone was much bigger than most everyone else around me. And I was okay with that. And for the most part, the people that were senior to me were okay with it because they knew, like, hey, we at least have, and I wasn't the only one. There were usually like 2 or 3 of us that were that way, but, you know, there were the guys like, hey, give him that plane, give him this mission, he'll be fine. And I enjoyed that role. I enjoyed filling that for the squadron.
Do you feel, though, that you were willing to push the envelope and you were willing to try things that were out of the norm, but because for the greater majority of time they ended on a positive note,
yep,
that definitely builds in the sense of, all right, he might push the envelope, but we're going to let him run with it, as opposed to if you were crashing helicopters all the time, you know?
Yeah. And it's interesting across the Marine Corps, not to sidetrack the discussion, but it's a somewhat common trait in people who end up performing at a higher level in aviation specifically. So, like, I ended up on this track where I went to the weapons and tactics school as a student, got asked to go back as an instructor. And around the time I was going back as an instructor, the Marine Corps was really doing a deep dive into aviation safety. And there was a lot of talk about how the majority of mishaps, I don't want to say majority because I don't remember 100% if that's factually, but how a lot of the mishaps were weapons and tactics instructors in the seat. And at the time, I remember feeling like, well, of course it is. For one, they're doing all the hardest missions, but for two, these are the people that are most prone to push that envelope and the most comfortable operating on top of it. And obviously, on occasion, maybe we'll push it a little too far. So I was part of that population, and people within the Marine Corps Aviation had a lot of opinions about weapons and tactics instructors and that whole program for that reason. And sometimes, you know, we were kind of seen as the guys maybe that were a little rogue or maybe pushed a little too far, we're a little too overconfident. And there's really a fine line there that you're skating with all of those things. But I was aware that I was part of that population, and I was okay with it. Like I was comfortable there. And I always just kind of thought of it as like, you know what, I'm going to play to win. And if we win, great. That's what's supposed to happen. And if it catches up to me, then, oh, well, I'd rather be doing it that way and have it catch up to me than get in any way what I thought of as like timid or hesitant.
That's where I was going with this, is that at any point in time in your career, did you have a point where you kind of like, oh man, maybe I should back off a little bit Or did you just kind of like, hey, this is me and this is the best way that I operate?
I didn't ever second guess it, even at points when logically I thought maybe I should. And it was most evident to me, honestly, a lot of times at home, because once I got to that place mentally, I was just there, and I was always there. It wasn't a switch I could flip. And I talked about that some in the book too, how it's impossible to be this person that you need to be as a combat aviator and then go back to your house in the suburbs of San Diego and just be like a regular dude. That was really hard. And so honestly, the person that pointed it out to me probably the most was my wife, about like kind of how it affected my personality on the whole, how I was functioning as a human being. But at the time, I couldn't articulate it. I couldn't tell you why, but I just believed this is how I need to be because it keeps me and other people alive. And so regardless of what the fallout or negative effects of that might be, I'm not going to mess with this formula. But then over the years, I became progressively more aware that I did need to do that at some point. The question was just like, well, what's the point? And at what point will that make sense for me to do that and to unpack this and examine it and thinking about it? And I kind of decided, I think it was around the time I was a major in Afghanistan. By that point, I was completely aware of like who I was and how I'd gotten there, but still just totally like had quadrupled down on this is the formula that works and I'm not going to adjust it. But I also knew like, hey, you can't do this forever. And that's kind of where I started initially thinking, okay, at this point, maybe you get command, maybe you don't. But whenever that is, when that's over, that's probably, if you make it to there, that's probably the time you need to stop. And so I just kind of set my sights on that. And that's ultimately what I ended up doing.
I want to go back to one of the stories just because, again, reading it and it was something, and I'm trying to put my mind around it. There's a particular mission when you go to take off, you're having your external fuel bladder was having some issues and you're like, no problem. We'll just manually, transfer fuel in the process. Go to start manually transferring fuel and it won't happen. So now on the fly, you've got to recalculate, do I have enough fuel to get back?
Yeah.
And in the story, you're explaining how you're also flying now in a brownout. So you're dealing with all of that. And I believe your co-pilot has to get visual bearing to the opposite side. So they're tied up. Am I understanding correctly that your crew chief was actually working the throttle kind of in between you?
So what happened? Yeah, that was a crazy day. But it was one of those days where everything seems fine at first and we take off and this fuel gauge is dead, but we know there's fuel in this external tank that we can transfer. We start flying into Iraq and we were inserting these guys several miles across the border. And it's just, we're going to drop them off. They're going to set up at EPW camp, prisoner of war camp, and then we're going to come back. But as we were transiting up there, I'm looking at the fuel and I'm quickly realizing like, this tank over here is not transferring. There's 4,500 pounds of fuel in that tank. So that immediately put us in a situation where it's like, we're going to cut this close. Then we get up there, we get these guys inserted, and it's taken forever to get them off the aircraft because they were interpreters, not actual Marines. Actual Marines would have been off that aircraft in a couple minutes. These guys were pretty lost in the sauce, and in fairness, we were dropping them off in the middle of nowhere. They didn't want to get off the aircraft and have us fly away. It looked like we just dropped them off in the middle, literally in the middle of the desert.
I'm picturing an Uber ride. The guy goes, all right, here, get out. You're like, this ain't where I'm supposed to be.
They're looking at us like, are you serious? And we're like, sorry, this is the grid. So that whole production, we just ended up wasting more fuel on the ground getting those guys off. So now we're flying back to Kuwait and I'm doing the math again. And I was like, this looks pretty bad. Like, we're going to cut this really close. And honestly, what happened was I was flying with another guy who was essentially my peer. He was in my peer group, but a little bit behind me in qualifications. And it just got to be a lot for him. It was a very stressful situation. So I asked the crew chief to come set up on the jump seat. To start working the speed control levers for me. I was like, hey, keep us at what we called it maximum range, which is, some settings in the aircraft to where we can go the furthest possible. told the other aircraft we were flying with, hey, take the lead and take us straight to the FARP, which is essentially the gas station in Kuwait, and we're going to see how this works out. So the whole way flying back, I literally had to switch it up to where I was flying left-handed, redoing the math with my right hand on my knee board. Crew chief's helping me with the speed control levers, pulling an engine back here and there to max it out. And we barely made it. Like, we literally landed in the fuel pits in Kuwait and was like, oh, we made it. And one engine flamed out, then another one flamed out. So we got about as close as you can to running out of gas without quite running out of gas, and definitely had less gas than we're supposed to when we landed. There's minimums and rules, and we exceeded that for sure. But it was like, your choice was land in the middle of nowhere in the desert in Iraq and hope it works out. And I certainly wasn't going to do that.
Well, and it's like you said, though, there were, as you're reading your account of the story, you can kind of see like the, oh shit, kind of climbing that ladder. But one of the big things you talk about is these guys needed to get off this damn helicopter, and they were taking their time. And like you can see where this is going. It's like, wait, we're burning a lot of fuel just sitting here waiting. But for me, what kind of came to my mind when I was reading the story is I'm picturing back to being a kid. And for those of us old enough to remember the old, big fold out physical maps, and your dad would go, here, hold the steering wheel while these look, he's still working the gas and the brake, driving down the road. You're just kind of keep it straight. Yeah,
it was a little bit like that, but it was an interesting flight. That crew chief and I to this day are still in touch, and every now and then he'll shoot me a note on that day of the year and just say like, hey, thanks, that was a wild day. And I'm like, yeah, thank you, it was a wild day.
The other thing where I found interesting is in some of the transports, you break down the helicopters and throw them in a C-130. But then there's other times where you're doing long flight with air refueling. What's the longest flight you've ever done?
So with air refueling is one of the ones I think we talked about a little bit last time, but on my first deployment and my last deployment, we did some really long overwater stuff out in the Pacific. So my first deployment right after 9/11, the Marine Corps stood up a special purpose MAGTF, and we were all going to go to Guam to do what from there. I'm still not sure. But it was a big spool up. And we flew from Okinawa to Iwo Jima, and then from Iwo Jima to Guam. And it was a little over 5 hours over water on each leg. And that was still probably the least intelligent thing I ever did in a 53, because there's nowhere to go out there. I mean, you're out of the open ocean, and if something goes wrong, like, I guess we're going to ditch and hope it works out. Yeah. And so we had all this, mitigation. We had rafts in the back and all these things, but it's still, it wasn't a great plan. But those were really long flights.
Did I ask you then, or is there basically an autopilot at some point where you can just click it and the helicopter is virtually flying itself?
Sort of. I mean, there are trim functions that will, for the most part, hold altitude and airspeed if they're working appropriately. But we literally had a whole procedure for what's called ditching. That was in our little NATOPS pocket checklist, like if we'd had to do it, we would brief it and we knew what we were supposed to do. Thankfully, I never actually had to do it. But essentially, it's a procedure where you get down and you kind of land on the water. Everyone jumps out, and then one pilot stays in and sort of taxis the aircraft further away and then shuts it down. And as it's rolling over and starting to sink, he hopefully gets out. And that's the procedure, yeah. As ridiculous as that sounds, that's the procedure.
So to keep people interested in the book, you've already mentioned the 160th and their special function.
Yeah.
You did get asked to help on a couple missions. There's one significant one. I'll leave that for the readers. But as far as you being asked and brought into that had to be a huge sense of validation as to your abilities and your reputation.
Yeah, and really for the whole unit. And in both cases, it kind of started random, but we knew, or I certainly was aware, like, hey, if we do this and we do it well, that's going to be a good thing for all of us, right? It's going to get us as a unit more involved in what's going on in theater, and it's good for the community as a whole to have 53 squadrons out there doing good things. So it really came up twice for me. The first time was in 2005. I was in Iraq for the third time, and there was a task force that had been formed in country to really, their whole purpose was to hunt the number one high value target in country at the time. And so they were made up of, they had this composition of just this hodgepodge of different special operators from different forces and groups. And at the time, the 160th, the Night Stalkers, had aircraft that were organic to that task force, and that was typically how they did it. But the Night Stalkers at that time also were so busy in Afghanistan still that their CH-47s were not present in Iraq. So they had 60s, they had little birds, but they didn't have any big assault support aircraft. And so those task force guys just walked over to our squadron one day, and me and my buddy, Dave Payne, we were both captains at the time, happened to be there when they walked in, and they were just doing a basic feasibility of support. Like, hey, we don't have our 47s here. You guys fly a similar profile, have similar capabilities. Is this something we might be able to do? And there's official channels for requests like that, but they didn't want to waste their time with official requests until they got kind of the unofficial answer first.
Let's make sure we're going to get a yes before we ask.
Yeah. So really it ended up being me and my buddy Dave making handshake deals that weren't really ours to make with these operators. Like, yeah, we can totally do that. A couple of captains. And then from there, they went and ran up their chain. We ran up ours and started working with them, and that went well. And then it came up again for me in 2011 in Afghanistan as a major. And that time it came up for really, it was kind of a couple of reasons, but the special ops guys were so busy in Afghanistan at that point that the Task Force 160 at the Night Stalkers was having a hard time filling all of the requests. Just doing executing everything that was requested of them was challenging. And then they got themselves into a tough situation out on the Pakistani border and needed some help, and ultimately asked the Marine Corps for help. Totally random that I was there when that happened, that I was in the squadron when it happened, and then ended up flying that mission myself for what we call a tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel, a trap. Essentially, we need to go get one of their aircraft, but that was a wild 24 hours from first phone call to go execute, and especially knowing who we were going to help, because those guys are amazing. Like they're some of the best assault support pilots in the world. So just going into it, I knew, hey, if they got themselves into a tight spot out here, then where we're going is bad. Like this is going to be a challenging area to get into. It's going to be challenging landing zone. All of those things, I knew everything was going to be varsity, to execute that. But we were fortunate that we were able to go help them there. And then that really kind of opened the floodgates for us, because then they knew, hey, there's this other unit over here that can help with some of these other missions that we can't do. And so they started pushing a lot of their additional requests, the overflow that they couldn't handle, to the Marine Corps, which ultimately got handed to us, which made for a really wild deployment. So we did a lot more named operations and inserts and raids and extracts and all the things than we would have done normally, just because that had started early in the process.
But prior to that, there was no type of cross-training before deployment in any of that concept?
Sort of. So in the Marine Corps, basically the way it works is they have I talked about it a little bit before, but the weapons and tactics instructors course. Every squadron is required to have a couple pilots that have graduated from that course. And then you learn all of those things when you go through that course. Like you come out of there and you should really be able to go execute any mission, just about anything, and have a full understanding of not only your aircraft, but how all the other players work and what happens there. And on staff at MOTS 1, who runs that course, there's always a pilot from the Task Force 160th. So there's a tiny bit of integration there between the services at that high level. Now, it's slightly different in the Army in that, I won't say all, but they have basically this huge concentration of their best aviators are part of the Night Stalkers in that unit. Where in the Marine Corps, you have 2, 3, maybe 4 people in an average squadron that have similar training. So instead of a whole squadron that's trained like that, like the Night Stalkers, you got 3 or 4 guys. But every squadron should be capable of integrating and doing just about anything we need to do. It's just not what we do every day or every night like they do. But it was always fun working with them. They're such professionals and so good and fun to work with. But typically it was, hey, we're doing our mission. We need you guys to do this one for us. Not so much we're flying together in the same flight or anything like that.
Going back to
shutting down the emotions, becoming a little bit more robotic. You have an experience where you literally and figuratively came face to face with an RPG. In looking back on that, is it that you were able to compartmentalize the, oh shit, he's got an RPG, because you were so fixated on all the other tasks that you had to do? Or were you just completely shut down from that emotional, like, freak out component?
I would say I was pretty, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say shut down, but I was very good at controlling my emotion in the aircraft specifically. And we used to talk about it and brief it in different ways. We say no fast hands in the cockpit. But I kind of early in my combat deployment started using the term, like, if you get excited, you get dead. And that was something I initially was just saying to myself in my head and started eventually saying to other people. But the way I thought about that was emotion, it clouds your thought process. It makes you think slower. It makes you indecisive. And in that environment, you don't have room for that. You need to be able to make a decision like right this second if that's what's required. And I just got very adept at being that way. And so other people would comment on it as being robotic. I always just kind of thought of it to myself as being very calm. But it was when I was in that right mindset, it felt like everything was happening in slow motion. I could see everything clearly. I could process all of the information. I could make decisions quickly. I didn't second guess myself. And that didn't mean I was always making the right decision, but I was very comfortable saying, okay, do this. Okay, now we're going to do that. But yeah, I remember in that specific instance, it was just taking too long to get the guys picked up out of the landing zone, which is never a good situation. And I was sitting there monitoring while we were trying to get them on board. And so those guys pop out with the RPG and just calmly called it over the radio to our escorts, and they took care of it. But it kind of happened really textbook the way that it should. And so I didn't think a lot of it in that moment. But it was certainly one of those things where later I was like, yeah, you probably should have been a little more freaked out about that than you were.
From the flip side, and I'll put myself in the realm of like a SWAT or tactical operation. You've got a field of fire that's in sector A. Mm-hmm. You perceive a threat in sector B, but your job is to stay on sector A, and you need to have the confidence to know that your teammates around you are going to pick up B. Is that a little bit of what you were kind of in the sense of you knew that you had assets who could address it? It was just merely pointed out, you guys handle it. I'm going to stay focused on what I need to focus on.
Yeah, it was really it. It was all very, honestly, kind of textbook, the way it transpired. Hey, there's a threat. You call it out. They see it right away. They roll in. They take care of the threat. And that's really what they're there for. So that was everything working together, orchestrated exactly as it should. So it felt almost routine, as odd as that sounds. But it got executed so smoothly. It was just kind of one of those things. But it was certainly one of those moments that I had in my career where later I was like, yeah, you're kind of weird. Like, that should have probably shaken you up a little bit. Something. Like, what's wrong with you?
Staying on the combat aspect of it, any stories that didn't end up in the book that were significant to you?
No, not really. I think I got the big stuff in there. I mean, there were so many things that happened. It was certainly difficult to kind of whittle it all down. So I tried to sort of hit the highlights there in big picture, make sure I did. But yeah, there was nothing that I can think of offhand that was like big or momentous that I chose to leave out in terms of things that happened in actual operationally.
What about the great mountain bikes? Did they end up coming home with you?
No, we left those there. And then the second time we went back, we got smart. I talked about we bought them online and mailed them to ourselves ahead of time. But that first time was like, oh my God, this base is huge. It was taking us forever to walk back and forth from where we lived on one side to where we worked, and they had these local merchants on base for whatever reason. There's a little soccer stadium, and they were just selling junk, tchotchkes and bootleg DVDs. But this one guy had these mountain bikes, and me and my buddy John Pfeiffer were like, yeah, let's go get those.
So I want to transition to now more the personal side, because you hit both sides in the book. We've talked about the combat stories, the struggles that you had, both from, let's say, the alcohol side, but also from the family side. Yeah. I mean, you really put yourself out there. From I guess my first question will be, when you went back to write the book, was it as a parent in reading your journals that it was a problem? Or was it like, wow, I didn't, it's like when you have the opportunity to go back and reread it, were you writing it down, but it not registering at the time? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say my understanding of all of that just slowly progressed over time. So in the early stages of it, it was really like that flurry where I did 3 deployments to Iraq in that 2003 to 2005 time frame. I was home for brief periods in the middle, but that's when, call it the negative side of what I had become was starting to become apparent, or was coming out in a way that wasn't good at home and was being pointed out to me. And there's a lot of complexity to that, and just the interpersonal relationship with spouse and all of those things that are complicated enough in the best of circumstances. But at the time, in that early stages, I was really just doing it, and it was all instinct and it was all gut, and I couldn't even tell you why I was doing it. Later, it started to become progressively more apparent over time, like, oh, this is, you were behaving in these ways, which people read the book and I'm very honest about it in there. But to me, like, especially with the drinking back then, it was sort of twofold. Part of it was that it was a bit cultural in the Marine Corps at the time, not to blame it on that or to say that that's negative. It just kind of was. That was sort of what we did. It was how we blew off steam. But I also later came to understand about myself that there's an element of risk there that is also just naturally appealing to me. I later came to understand, like, I like risk. I thrive on risk. I'm attracted to risk. I like chaos. And sometimes in the absence of that, I would subconsciously create that for myself. So that was part of it. But it also was just a way to kind of turn it off when you needed to turn it off. And that was really the way that to me was the most unhealthy, that I understood later and realized later. It was, I was feeling these things and I would have these moments typically when it got quiet. Like, I was fine when I was busy, when I was going and doing all the things, I felt fine. But on those rare occasions where it got quiet, it's a Friday night and I'm starting to feel bored and anxious and agitated and my mind starts racing, it was just an easy way to kind of turn that off, at least for a little while. And it was also a way, I always felt like, I'll probably feel this way my whole life, like there's this balloon inside of me that's slowly filling with air. And I don't know what's going to happen if it pops, but it just seems like it would be bad. So it was also just a way to let air out of that balloon. It was a decompression exercise. And I wasn't alone in that. I mean, it was actually pretty, call it common behavior, which also made it seem normal and not something that I was too interested in questioning earlier or at that stage of my life. We were kind of all doing it. I just happened to be married, but there were plenty of guys who were single and they could go, run around a Pacific beach and do whatever they wanted to. And no one cared. It was fine. But then for the handful of us that were trying to do something similar in our living rooms, it wasn't working out as well. It was tricky for sure.
To get a better understanding from what I read and putting my mind around it, if I'm understanding correctly, because you knew that you were going to eventually, at some point in time, deploy again, you never wanted to come too far down from what I'll put in air quotes as readiness.
Yep.
And so when you were at home, you were never really at home because in your mind, I need to be ready to deploy again. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's basically it. Yeah. Once I kind of got myself to that place, I just stayed there. And some of that was just by virtue that I did those 3 deployments to Iraq in such rapid succession that I knew you don't really have time to reset and start over here. And I didn't want to risk attempting to do that. Like, it just seemed too risky because the stakes were so high. I mean, to me, the stakes were literally, you're either going to live or you're not. And I'd even gone so far as to accept that in all likelihood, at some point, I was going to be a half second too slow. And something was going to catch up to me. There were just too many things that could possibly go wrong. And if I was going to keep doing this, the odds were decent that it was going to catch up to me. And that in of itself, although I was okay with it, I now realize like just that acknowledgement and understanding really weighed on me over time too. I mean, it's not normal to spend the entirety of your 30s walking around thinking like, well, I wonder if I'll still be here next month or next year. And it's not like you consciously think about it all the time, but I just sort of had this awareness of it. And it wasn't something I thought about a lot. And it was something I was strangely okay with for me. But I also, at the same time, felt a lot of guilt for my wife, my, at the time, daughter. Like, you almost feel like this guilt, like, man, you guys are in a crappy situation because of me and what I'm doing. But I just have to keep doing it. And it creates this really bizarre situation in your mind where like kind of who you've become and who you need to be professionally isn't necessarily great personally, but you don't feel like you can change that. At the time, I didn't feel like I could change that. And I tried to be as present as I could be at home. And I wasn't, abusive or crazy or anything. I would just kind of check out sometimes when I needed to. That was really what I was doing. But I tried to be there with them as much as I could be when I was home, especially with our daughter when she was little. I spent a lot of time with her when I could. But for my own emotional attachment was very guarded and was really hard to get back there. And I'm sure that was 100% just some self-preservation of your own emotions, like knowing what you have to go do again. It was hard to make those connections really well at that time.
It almost seemed like in some of what you mentioned, spending time with your daughter, it seemed to me that you would pick one thing or a thing to bury yourself in to keep your mind from thinking about all the other stuff.
It's a very good way. It's a very, very accurate description. Yeah, and very perceptive. And that was definitely the case. I'm still that way. Like, I need something all the time to like focus on and do and concentrate on. When I am not happy is when I don't have that. If I have too much free time, downtime, I'm sitting around looking for something to do. I hate that. I've always hated that. Like, I need something to be like, okay, we're doing this now, and really kind of dial in and focus on that one thing. And that's actually challenging for me because typically my brain's going 1,000 miles an hour in 5 different directions, and I'm able to function that way. And in some ways it's a superpower, in some ways it's a curse. Like, sometimes it's really handy in a cockpit when there's a million things going on and you're looking at 100 gauges and talking on 5 radio frequencies and flying and navigating and thinking about what's going to happen, at the next checkpoint. But at other times when you're trying to just relax at home and act like a normal dude, it kind of sucks. It can mess with you.
For somebody who might be listening and maybe they perceive that they're struggling with this or they don't, you talk about, obviously, you don't hide the fact that you were drinking a lot while you're at home, but what kind of levels of drinking are we talking about? Because you never really put it in a measurable term. You just talk about drinking a lot.
I would say, I have to think about, I'm trying to think in terms of quantity. I would say I will talk in terms more of like end result was just have enough drinks that like you just kind of stop feeling it, right? Enough to like really slow your thought process down, stop feeling it. In my mind at the time, I would think of it in terms of let enough air out of the balloon that I can go to sleep. Like, that was really kind of the goal. Was I want to be able to like actually go to sleep and stay asleep. And that's really what I was doing, right? Like, it wasn't anything, I'm sure it depends on who you ask. To me, it didn't seem that abnormal compared to anything that a lot of other guys I knew were doing. And to some degree, on occasions when you're with your buddies, it just falls into it's a play hard category. But that was really it. It was just trying to turn it off. And that was the term I used to use. Like, I need to turn my brain off. I don't want to think about this stuff anymore. And it wasn't like you sit down and go, I'm going to turn my brain off now and let's go as fast as I can to do that. You would just, I noticed over time that that's kind of naturally where I would gravitate when I gave myself the room to do it. It's sort of like, okay, you let your guard down. You're kind of relaxing a little bit. You have a couple beers. You're watching the game, whatever. But it just felt nice to stop having your brain going 1,000 miles an hour. So it was just, go to the point where that kind of stops and you can enjoy that that's not happening for a little bit and then actually go to sleep.
You and your wife have an amazing story getting together, and she put up with a lot.
It's a long and complicated story for sure.
Was there ever a point where you actually had that conversation of, this is just what I need to be able to do when I'm at home? Or did you try to fool yourself into thinking she doesn't really realize I'm going to this level when I'm at home?
No, I was very aware, and she was very aware, and it certainly came up at times. But I think, and this is my perspective for certain, but I think we both were experiencing the opposite ends of something that was extremely difficult for both of us. I think both of us would say that there are things we wish we had done a little better or a little differently in how we went about that. But really kind of what ultimately happened, and the best way I can describe it, is that we both just ended up functioning as individuals and not a couple, because neither of us really had the bandwidth to be what the other person needed us to be. And normally, or I should say more often than not, what happens in that situation is you just ultimately split up. It's not an accident that the divorce rate in the military and in professions like that is astronomically high. We never chose to do that, but had we, it would be the least surprising thing that ever happened, right? I don't think anyone would be shocked by that, and it wouldn't even necessarily be anyone's fault. Although you could certainly say, well, there's these things from this person and this from this person, but the scenario was just extreme, and so we just kind of got used to functioning that way. And there were certainly things that I did or was doing that bothered her, but I didn't really know how to explain it at the time, and I didn't understand it well enough myself to be able to articulate it. I just knew or believed this is me, and this version of me works. Like, this version of me is keeping me and other people alive, so I don't want to risk messing with this formula.
Well, and I think one of the dichotomies that you have to factor into those of us who have spent careers in service. Mm-hmm. You brought up earlier that at the end of the day, though, you enjoyed what you were doing.
I did.
And for many of us, we get into these careers, these professions, because of what we're able to do. Mm-hmm. And then you factor into that, oh, wait, now I've got a family. I'll put it on the first responder side. There are many nights where that phone goes off at 2:00 in the morning, and there's a little part of you that's like, damn, I really don't. But then that the other little voice in your head goes, this is going to be fun. Let's go. Mm-hmm. And sadly enough, we have to push our family aside. Yep. And we over rely on the fact that, they're going to be there when I get home. And like you said, sometimes, in many instances, the person sitting at home gets tired of being the person sitting at home.
In fairness, for certain. And that certainly, I think, was a component of what we experienced and to some degree still experience. I think a lot of what we lived through and experienced, it'll always be with us. It'll be something that won't ever completely, totally be reconciled. It's more of working to a place of kind of acceptance, understanding, and sort of being okay with, hey, this is what you did, this is what I did. Yeah, we could have handled that better. And that's still difficult to this day, and I think always will be difficult. But it's just, that's the byproduct of living this call extreme, lifestyle. And in my case, for certain, I mean, especially like talking about drinking and stuff, like that wasn't like call it a daily part of the routine. It was more or less comes up when you had some downtime, so typically it was like, hey, you have some downtime, things get quiet. That's when those sort of things would come about. It was that, I won't say fear, but that avoidance of being in the moment in that downtime when you had time to think. It was easier just to stay in that go 1,000 miles an hour mode, and we're going to work hard and we're going to do these things, and I'm studying, I'm flying, I'm doing stuff at the squatter, and now I'm home for a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go to bed. This crazy cycle of even when you were home, you're just going so fast. I didn't want that time to sit around and think about it. I mean, really, all of it was just an avoidance of that. It's like, just keep moving forward. Just keep doing what you're doing, how you're doing it. It works. Don't mess with it.
How much of I'll call it maybe not even the speed of deployment, but the frequency of deployment, both combat deployments, training assignments, was driven by you where you were looking for it? And how much of it was just the natural flow of your progression?
For the most part, it was just circumstantial. It just had to do with my timing. Like I said earlier, it was either great or terrible, depending on how you look at it when I got to the fleet. But that was just our unit was in that rotation, and we were going fast. I mean, there were certainly some extra training things that I ended up doing just by virtue of progressing to becoming a weapons and tactics instructor required that I do some extra training, and just going to that school in of itself was another 6 weeks away from home, at a time when we only had I think it was a 7 or 8 month turnaround between deployments. So some of it was a byproduct of me personally, but for the most part, it was just that's what the unit was being asked to do, and I was part of that. And it was also an unusual time in that prior to that, it was very unusual for someone to do more than 2 deployments in one set of orders. You're in a squadron usually 4 years, you do 2 deployments, and they send you to do something else. Just because of the way things went, I stayed 5.5 years and did 4 deployments, which was very unusual. But I was also, in fairness, all about it. Like, that's where I wanted to be. That's what I wanted to be doing. So I was happy to extend and do 1 more deployment. But at the end of that third one to Iraq, I knew, like, okay, you need to go take a break somewhere, somehow. Go take a break.
I think the other thing too that becomes a factor is that a lot of us who are not in a government or federal job and maybe in looking at others, your family didn't move much, but you still have to factor in all of the moves that your family had to deal with.
Yeah, for sure. And it wasn't crazy, but there were enough. So when I finished up that third tour in Iraq, I got orders. We moved out to Arizona for 3 years. And then we went to DC for a year for school, and then came back here to California. But I will tell you, and we did this twice, where we moved back-to-back summers, those really take it out of you. Because we would get to the East Coast, get settled, kids are in school for 1 year, and then you're pulling them out and coming right back across the country. And those were hard on the kids and my wife, especially. As a mom, she was very concerned about them, getting them settled into routines and their friends and the other moms and all of those things. It's very disruptive. And we did that twice. Arizona to DC, back to here. Then 3 years later, we went to DC and then came right back a year later again. But I would say the second time we did that back-to-back summer moves, that's when I was pretty certain my family was like, hey, Dad, we don't know what you're doing.
It's about time to mutiny.
Yeah, we don't know what you're doing after this, but I think we're good. Like, we'd rather not keep going on this crazy train.
Any residual from your kids, kind of now that they've gotten older? Hey, Dad, I really didn't like X.
Not a ton. If they're thinking that, they've been very good about not saying it. I would say our daughter took the brunt of it just because she was the older one. She was born, in 2002, right before OIF. So those first 3 deployments to OIF, she was around. She was little. So I spent as much time as I could with her when I was home between those deployments. But by the time those were done, she was almost 4, and I felt like I barely knew her. And that was really a priority for me when we moved from there to Arizona to kind of make that connection with her. And I think I was successful in that. And then our son was born in 2008 while we were in Arizona. So he was still young enough that he wasn't really aware of what was going on until I was a little closer to being finished. So even when I went to Afghanistan in 2011, he was only 3 at the time. So he doesn't remember that at all. But at that point, our daughter was old enough to know at least just enough that, like, I don't know exactly what Afghanistan is, but I know when grown-ups talk about it, it sounds bad. And my dad's going there. But she was always she has a very similar personality to me, for better or for worse. Kind of compartmentalized, very together, very stoic, quiet. So if it was weighing on her, she didn't say much about it. And she's gone on to do great. I mean, she's getting ready to graduate from college. She's done well. She has never come back and complained at all, to her credit. And she has plenty of reasons that she could. But our son, I think, fortunately, was young enough that he missed a lot of that. And so it's a little different for him. And then now that he's a teenager, he has questions about it because he was a little guy when it was happening, and he doesn't really remember much about it.
We've already talked about it a little bit, but you, in the book, obviously address it. You got to a practice of you would have a friend or somebody else pick you up for a deployment and not subject your family to that saying goodbye. And I can understand your thought process in that now if they're at the base and they're saying goodbye, that's hard on me. But aren't you still basically going through it saying goodbye at home?
You are. But to me, it was when I went to Iraq the first time. My wife dropped me off and our daughter was in the car, and we had this whole thing with her. She was born premature. She's in the hospital for a few weeks. We just brought her home that October, I think. And then in January, I was leaving. She was still like on monitors. It was just it was an emotional event, saying goodbye to them at the squadron and going to combat the first time, and your mind's racing and you're thinking about all the things that could happen. You're thinking, am I ever going to see these two people again? And all the things associated with that. It was just too damn hard on all of us. And so after that, I just decided I'm never doing that again. I'm going to get someone to take me to the squadron. I'll do this at home. It won't be any less difficult at home. But at least then I was giving myself a car ride from home to the squadron to kind of get back into character. And so I was really just buying myself a few minutes on I-15 to go, okay, you need to be who you need to be the second you walk into this hangar. But I basically gave myself some time to make sure I could get there.
For you, well, you address it in the book, so I'm not letting anything out. You also had something else to deal with while you were on deployment, that your mom and dad separated. Mm-hmm. How big of a shock was that to you?
It was challenging, and it just so happened that it was like this confluence of events all happened simultaneously. So at the time, that was my 4th deployment, my 3rd in a row to Iraq. So there's all the stress associated with that, trying to finish that up, make sure we got the whole squadron out of there in good shape again. At the same time, things at home had become very strained between me and my wife. And again, not really anyone's fault, just all the things that had happened, how much I was gone and being deployed to combat. And my parents I had known had some challenges for a while. So it wasn't totally surprising, but the timing was just kind of, time it just kind of felt like, well, we may as well throw this in there too. Let's just do all the things at one time. And mostly, I was obviously grown and gone at that point. But so I was mostly just concerned about them and for them. I will say now, I think that, in both cases, that was probably for the best and they're in a good place. And we all kind of came back to a place where as a family, we're good. But it was just like one more life event, if you will, to navigate at the same time I was navigating all of these other things. So I'll always probably think of that fall of 2005 as like arguably my most difficult period of my life.
I survived a lot.
Navigating all of these things at once and coming home from a 3rd combat deployment to a wife who's like, at that point, like, I was definitely not, the favorite person on her list, in fairness. We had a lot to figure out. The stuff had just happened to my parents. I had a lot to figure out. And And honestly, at that point, I hadn't had time to process any of it. Like it had all just happened so fast that I was just doing it. And that was really the very beginning of me to start kind of trying to at least rationally think about what had transpired, how it affected me, how I was handling it, how had I handled it, how could I handle it go forward. It was a challenging time period for sure.
From the emotional side for you, in looking back on it now, and maybe you realized it at the time, was there stuff that you weren't journaling because you just didn't want to think about it or address it?
No, I actually was still like making sure I caught all of it. And I remember at the time thinking, observing that I was making note of everything, even though I wasn't always capable of feeling it. So there were a lot of times when these things would be happening and it would almost seem just very businesslike to me. It was like looking at a series of facts without any of the emotion tied to it, seeing it pretty clearly, or at least thinking I saw it pretty clearly, but becoming more and more aware of like, you should be feeling something about this. And really I was feeling nothing. It was an observation. I felt empathy for other people, but I didn't feel that like sadness for myself, or I wasn't upset like I probably should have been, or anyone should have been or could have been at the time about any of those things.
There was an instance where you lost a friend and fellow pilot, and you talk about how you broke down crying, and it really kind of hit you like a ton of bricks. But then going forward from that, it was like there wasn't even tears anymore.
Nothing.
Did it ever get to a point for you where it almost kind of scared you that you were losing that emotional connection?
It didn't scare me, but I was very aware of it. And that is definitely when that happened, when he passed away, that was kind of the trigger that started me. I was already going down this road, and that just like accelerated me to 1,000 miles an hour of just shutting down all of those emotions, because I felt like I needed to do that, not necessarily to survive, sounds dramatic, but just to be who I needed to be, keep my head in the game and do what I needed to do. I needed to be not affected by those things. And so I navigated that, and it was really hard. It was really emotional. It was traumatic, but I came out of that and just kind of told myself, like, you can't do that again. Like you're not going to be able to do that again, and it's going to happen again. So you need to do something to make sure you're ready to deal with it. And that really just kind of threw gas on that fire of accelerating me towards just shutting all those emotions down. And I just stayed that way from that point forward.
With the issues that you had with your wife, and you talk about in the book about going to counseling, did that counseling continue even after you came out of the military?
Oh, yeah. I would say it was even more vital then. You know, while we were in the military, while we were still in the Marine Corps, it was, I think, a lot easier for both of us to say, well, we just need to get through this next thing. Just get through this next thing. Just get through this move, get through this deployment, get through this training detachment. But once I transitioned out and life kind of slowed down, started to feel a little bit normal, I think we both realized, like, yeah, we need to go back and kind of figure this out. And so we really started that process at that point with some real intentionality. And I will say that, you know, despite being intentional and despite doing the work, there are still times where it feels like we're on two different planets. And then there's times it feels like, oh, we have some common ground here again. And sometimes, you know, I won't speak for her, but you don't know how that's going to go. And sometimes I will wonder to myself, like, is this thing we experience just so crazy that it's never totally going to be reconciled for either one of us? And not even in a way that's kind of pointing at each other like, your fault, no, your fault. It's just such a wild ride to go on with somebody else, you know, in a relationship like that, and live through all those things and those experiences, and then come out of it and be like, okay, everything's fine now. It just doesn't work that way. I mean, there's things that I think will always kind of bother both of us, you know, for different reasons in different ways. And we both see the experience from a completely different lens.
And there's no way to know when that specific scab is going to flick off.
No.
Because it's not like you have any fair warning. It's just, and we've all experienced this.
Sure.
If you've been in a relationship, there's always something that you weren't even thinking about, whatever it is. And all of a sudden now it's a point of contention.
Right. Absolutely.
The book comes to the end. You talk about coming off your last deployment. Your family was there when you came home every time. And one of your favorite pictures, you and your family and your kids. But going back to that day, do you ever reflect on just that day? And did you think that, were you losing a little bit of yourself walking away?
No, I don't think so. I felt very good about the way everything had gone. I felt like I'd given everything I could give to the Marine Corps. I left it all in the field. I don't think that, as imperfect as I was throughout my career at times, it certainly wasn't a lack of effort. I mean, the Marine Corps definitely...
You were perfectly imperfect.
Yeah, they definitely got theirs. I mean, I was going 110% all day, every day for 20 years, and I felt good about that. And so I felt okay walking away when I did, and I haven't really looked back on it at all and thought, I should have kept going or taken one more set of orders or stuck around to get promoted one more time, because I feel like even if I had done that, it would have been a very different part of the experience. And the part that I loved the most and cherished was the part that I got to do, was really just being in the squadron and being one of the pilots and going out and doing the thing. Like, that's what I loved. And I knew that was over. Whether I stayed in the Marine Corps or not, I was never going to go back to a squadron and be a pilot and go on deployment again. And that was really, to me, it was just the essence of the experience. I loved it, but that was done.
Something that jumps out to me, and I'm sure that everybody who worked for you or under you appreciated, and it comes through in multiple stories, that you are really driven by taking care of your people.
100%.
Which I don't really think people who don't work in the type of space that we operated in understand how important it is to have leaders who care about the people that they're in command of.
I definitely did. And I think one of the more interesting aspects of, what people might take away from reading my story and going through this was, at the times when I was being the biggest handful with my peers or superiors, that was generally what was driving it for me. Was I was trying to do what I thought was the best thing for the squadron, for the group, to take care of our Marines. And I was always willing to speak up and say something if I felt like that was the case. And there were certainly times where that didn't work out well for me, or was viewed as, hey, you're not supposed to do that or say that. But if I felt like that's what was the best thing for the Marines, then that's what I was going to do. And I never really second guessed myself on that. And if that meant I got beat up or got my ass chewed or whatever, then that was fine. Like, I was willing to take that, on behalf of at least attempting to do what I thought needed to be done.
So moving into your actual transition, and I know we talked about it in the previous episode, but I know you've gotten involved in some nonprofits, but we've talked about in the book how you progressed to this virtually a robot who was completely turned off.
Yeah.
How did you turn yourself back on?
Well, I would say that will probably forever be a work in progress. I don't think I'll ever totally be there, but I've definitely made a lot of progress. And it really started with me being willing to go to counseling. And so I went to counseling the first time, I think it was 6 days after I flew my last flight in the 53. It was the next week. And I'd made that appointment ahead of time because I really wanted some help, like unpacking this in an appropriate way. And I also still just kind of had that belief, knowing myself, like, if I don't do this, this could really catch up to me in a way that's not good. And I don't want to be, one of those countless people that someday everyone's going like, the hell happened to that guy? He seemed like he had it together and he just went off the rails. So my basic idea was, let me go learn about this and kind of get real introspective and hopefully figure this out sooner rather than later. So I started that process. I still had a year left in the Marine Corps, actually, when I started it. And it carries on to this day. it's not a fast process, but it was something that's really helped me just develop a better sense of understanding for myself. And why do I have these motivations to do these things? What is it that I'm actually attracted to? What's the real underlying, call it root of what drives me to do X, Y, and Z? Just understanding those things is extremely helpful to me in just navigating the things I do today, 24 hours a day and all kinds of different ways. And really just helps me manage myself. And I think that's something that I'll always have to do and be doing to some degree. And I won't ever be done. I won't ever be like, oh, everything's good now. I'll still have my moments in my days where it doesn't feel good at all. But at least understanding all of that has been super helpful, like extremely helpful.
What are some of the nonprofits that you've affiliated yourself with?
So I do a fair amount of volunteer work with nonprofits. So one of them is Support the Enlisted Project. They're here in San Diego, amazing organization. And they do, basically what they do is come in and provide financial assistance and education to young Marines and sailors or any service member who gets themselves into financial trouble. Which I learned about them when I was still on active duty, and they helped some of our Marines, and I thought they were great, and they're very highly regarded in the nonprofit space. They just do a tremendous job. So that helps me feel a little bit connected. And then I work with the Marine Executive Association Camp Pendleton, which really helps veterans transition. So that's where I help other vets who are transitioning and try to navigate that. And any advice I can give, I'm happy to do. And that gives me a vehicle to do that. And then recently I got involved with another one called the Veterans Writing Group of San Diego County. Great group. And they really just help veterans of all shapes, sizes, eras, tell stories and write their stories. And they put together some books that are a collection of short stories from multiple veterans. So pretty neat organization there. So it's been neat to help them out some too.
Staying in that vein of helping and looking back, this is going to be a very loaded question, and it's probably going to be multiple parts. There's no way for you to obviously go back and make any changes. Mm-hmm. But now that you've had time to separate from it and now look back at your career, look back at what you put your family through. For somebody who might be still in the middle of that struggle, what some of the things that you would advise, and what might you have done differently if you could go back?
It's a really difficult question. It is a hard question to answer. And I'll start by saying my basic answer is I don't think I would do anything different, which probably sounds stubborn and bullheaded and maybe a little crazy, but I still feel like doing what I did was the best answer in a situation where there was no perfect answer, and in some cases even a good one. But it was the best one, not just for me as a person, but for everyone who was around me and all the other people I was helping or in some way at the same time. Especially my fellow Marines and service members that I was fighting and flying with. That version of me was the one that they needed me to be, or I felt like I needed to be for them on all those dark nights and all those dangerous places. So for that reason, I wouldn't change it. I would certainly hope that I would understand it better sooner so that I could do a better job of explaining and articulating some of those things at home. So it wasn't such a mystery, so to speak, as, because I know for certain, at times for my wife, I'm sure she was looking at me thinking like, what the hell's wrong with him? But that discussion didn't happen. And I'm not saying that that's her fault. Neither of us initiated discussions like that. So it just became this ongoing game of observation and frustration in some cases in both directions for different reasons. So it would have been helpful to figure some of that out sooner. But I do know, and I think this is really it's a catch-22, I think, for the Marine Corps, for the armed forces, for first responders, is we need people that are able to do that. You really need them. And if you start trying to play with that in a way where they can A, do that, and then B, walk around and be totally normal, congenial folks, that's a really dicey proposition. And if someone ever figures it out, then that'll be amazing. But I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. And I would be very hesitant personally to do that myself, just from based on my own experience. I always just kind of felt like I can't really start doing this, unpacking this, trying to understand this until I'm at a place where this other side of me is just no longer required.
How do I want to ask this question? What do you think your wife would say to that same question, though?
About me or about
in the same
herself?
situation?
She would say, yeah, that stubborn jerk. Of course that's what he's gonna say. He's gonna say he wouldn't change it. She knows me better than anybody. She knows that that's likely the answer. I think I would say she doesn't like that answer, but she's come to understand why that's the answer. But just getting to that point was challenging.
And the reason why I struggle with it a little bit, because in sitting here listening to you talk, and I can put myself in those same shoes of, you need both sides. These jobs require so much when we're on, and all of the people that are around us that are relying on us, and in turn, we're relying on them.
Yeah.
They need, and we need each other to be, as much as we're on, dialed into the job, we need to be off, dialed into the emotions, thinking about our family and all that kind of stuff. It is, you said it great. It's a weird dichotomy. And in a perfect world, you would be able to meet this balance of both. But for the most part, making a successful career out of this, you need more of I'm turning the family off.
Yeah, and I definitely wasn't good at it. I mean, if I had a weakness or a tragic flaw, that was it, was that I definitely let that stuff affect home. More so, I would say, with my spouse than the kids. For whatever reason, it was a little easier for me to be on and connected with them all the time when I was around them. Harder between me and her, just because there's so much more complexity between adults and how you're both behaving and how you're both perceiving things and et cetera. And I would certainly choose to kind of check out at times. And that's really what I did that was a negative. It wasn't like I was having a few beers and then losing my mind and acting crazy. It was just, hey, I'm going to sit on this couch and I'm going to shut this thing down for a little bit. So I'm going to be over here zoning out. Sorry, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Not quite with that exchange, but that's essentially the choice that you're making that is obviously unpopular for multiple reasons as you're doing it. And I totally understand that. It's totally understandable. But it's complex working through some of that stuff. And then still, like I said, to this day, trying to come back to a place of, call it mutual understanding and like, okay, I kind of understand, like I at least sort of understand why you did this and made these choices. I still don't like it, but at least it makes sense now. Where for a long time, I just think it just didn't make sense. It just seemed crazy, probably.
Going back to the book, and let's focus on the production aspect of it. How was the process in getting it to book form for you? Was it a struggle? Was it easy to find a publisher? All of that?
It was an education. It went pretty smooth, all things considered. I spent the majority of 2022 actually writing it. So, and again, I'm busy. I've got a million things going on. I've got a very busy job. So it was really like nights and weekends where I'm kind of jamming away on this. Spent most of the year writing it. And then in late 22, started really sending it out to potential publishers. And I'd already done enough homework at that point where I knew where to send it or which ones I thought would make sense to send it to. And then fairly quickly came to the conclusion that what was best for me, if I could find it, would ultimately be a hybrid publisher, which has some elements of self-publishing and some of traditional publishing experience. And the reason for that was because the standard publishers that I talked to, they had a lot of opinions about how I should go about doing this. And I frankly just didn't like any of them. Like I felt like, if I'm going to write something this personal, I want it to be exactly how I want it to be. Then I can live with it. I really didn't like the idea of losing control of that. because I was concerned that it would get molded into something else that wasn't what I was going for entirely. So I found a hybrid publisher, Acorn Publishing. They're actually based out of San Diego. They were awesome. They understood right away what I was trying to do, why I was trying to do it that way. And that was great. From that point forward was super helpful. And I got paired up with a great editor, and I really enjoyed working with her. And we, she helped me clean it up and polish it, and got it to where it is today, where it's coming out. The biggest obstacle in the whole process for me, and it wasn't really an obstacle, it was necessary, and I knew going in, was I had to send it to the Department of Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review for review, to make sure that I wasn't talking about anything in there that was still considered classified or that they didn't want me to share. And it took them a few months to go through the entirety of the manuscript and then send it back to me. And it's actually a pretty interesting process. It's a classic government doc that you send it to them as a Word doc, comes back as a PDF with literal the black bars over the details they want you to remove, which is in some ways kind of cool. And in other ways, it's like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And it was just kind of interesting to go through, like, really? They want me to take this out? Okay. So it was good. I mean, nothing that materially affected the story, but they asked me to remove some details. But that was the slowest part of the process. If it hadn't have been for that, I probably would have released this thing about 6 months ago.
When you went looking for a publisher, was a publishing company that specifically or has a propensity to working with veterans, was that important to you, or did you go the complete opposite, where like, I don't want that?
I wasn't actually particularly concerned about that, honestly. That made a little more sense had I gone with a traditional publisher. So there are publishers that focus more on military veteran type stories. But once I decided not to do that and to go hybrid, I wasn't super concerned about it. But interestingly, the publisher that I went with does have a few other prior military authors that write totally different types of books. They're all great, but they write different forms of fiction. So they had some familiarity with those guys. But also the editor that I worked with was kind of uniquely qualified to work with me, in that her first husband had been an Air Force pilot, was shot down over Vietnam and lost his life in a POW camp. And then she'd also later in life been married to a Marine backseater. So she had been around, military aviation really her entire life. I forgot to mention her father had been a pilot in the Air Force too. So she had sort of lived this experience, her own version of this experience. So she was very adept at helping me craft the story, and she understood exactly where I was trying to go and why I was trying to go there. So I really enjoyed working with her too.
Did this put any type of bug in you? You mentioned the Veterans Writers Club. Mm-hmm. Any ideas for more books?
I have a loose idea for a second one. That's probably about 2 years away, but I've kind of given it some thought. I enjoyed writing. Obviously, writing a memoir like this it's a one and done thing. There's no real sequel to something like that. Like, that's the thing. Here's what I did.
No, go back and rewrite it.
But I have an idea for another one. Something I might do down the road. But it kind of depends on how the rest of my professional career plays out and how other things come together. But I enjoyed the process, and I like to write, so I'll definitely be up for doing something else if it makes sense.
So where's the best place for people to get the book?
Honestly, the easiest place to get it is going to be on either barnesandnoble.com or Amazon. Is fastest and easiest for people to get on there and grab it. I'll be doing several events around San Diego over the next month, a couple on the East Coast over the summer. So you can go to my website, it's isaaccheely.com. There's a little section for events, and those will be there too if anyone wants to come try to track me down to get a signed copy.
Before we wrap it up, anything that we didn't cover that you want to make sure you get out?
I don't think so. Thanks for having me back. It's always an enjoyable discussion, and you do a great job of getting me to go all the places, and it's fun. Good time. So thank you.
Thank you again for your time, and I wish you the best on the book.
Hey, thank you so much.
I appreciate you watching. But before you go, if you like the video, please hit that subscribe button. Also, any comments are appreciated. Thank you.